For 80 years, Kiddieland was the first amusement park thousands of Chicago kids ever knew. Pony rides for a dime, a hand-carved wooden carousel, a roller coaster built in 1950 that never left the ground floor of anyone's childhood. Then, in 2009, the gates shut for good. The rides went dark. Today, a Costco parking lot sits on the exact spot where children used to scream with joy. And the thing that killed it wasn't a bigger, flashier competitor. It was family. To understand how that happens, go back to 1929, to a corner in Melrose Park, Illinois, right as the Great Depression started strangling the country. A builder and contractor named Arthur E. Fritz was watching his customers stop paying their bills. Work dried up, money dried up, and instead of holding on to what cash he had left, Fritz did something that looked, on paper, like a terrible idea. He spent it on 6 ponies. He set them up at the corner of North Avenue and First Avenue and started offering rides to local kids for a few cents a turn. It sounds naive. The country is collapsing financially, and this guy's betting that broke parents will still hand over a dime so their kid can ride a pony in a circle. But that's exactly the bet that worked. Even in hard times, especially in hard times, people find a little money for their children's happiness. The corner wasn't random either. It sat close to the Maywood Park harness racing track, which meant steady traffic, right in the middle of the dense, working-class western suburbs. Families who couldn't afford a trip downtown to Chicago's big attractions, but could afford a nickel for a pony ride on the way home from somewhere else. It was small, it was cheap, and it worked immediately. Within a couple of seasons, word had spread enough that Fritz wasn't just running a side hustle anymore, he was running a business. The ponies were just the start. Fritz noticed a Chicago newspaper was giving away small gas-powered miniature cars as a subscription incentive, and it gave him an idea. He bought a set of his own and lined them up next to the ponies. Kids who'd never sat behind the wheel of anything could suddenly drive their own little car around a track, and parents who'd never have paid for a real car ride could easily afford this one. By the mid-1930s, the operation had a name: Kiddieland. Most people don't know this, but Kiddieland is widely credited as the first amusement park in the country built around that exact name, aimed entirely at small children instead of teenagers or adults. Fritz tried to trademark it. He couldn't. The name was already spreading to copycats everywhere, which tells you how fast the idea caught on, and how obvious it suddenly seemed once someone had actually done it first. Through the 30s and 40s, the place kept growing, ride by ride, season by season. A German-style carousel arrived. 2 miniature steam-style locomotives, styled after Art Deco streamliners, started hauling kids around a tiny track, whistles and all, their little smokestacks puffing for effect. A roto-whip showed up in 1938, a Ferris wheel in 1940, modest by adult standards, but enormous to a 5-year-old looking up at it for the first time in their life. Kiddieland wasn't trying to be Riverview, Chicago's big teen and adult amusement park across town, the one with the real thrill rides and the long lines of teenagers. It was deliberately small, deliberately gentle, built at a scale where a 4-year-old could feel like they were riding something genuinely thrilling without ever being scared enough to cry. It wasn't competing with the big parks. It was filling a gap none of them wanted, and it turned out that gap was enormous. Somewhere in these early decades, Fritz made a decision that felt completely reasonable at the time, the kind every founder makes when thinking about what happens after they're gone. He planned to leave the land itself to one branch of his family, and the amusement park business to another. In 1929, even in the 1950s, that split didn't matter. The land under a pony ride wasn't worth fighting over. Nobody could have guessed that decades later, that same dirt would become worth more sitting empty than it ever was full of laughing kids and spinning carousel horses. We'll come back to that. For now, just remember it, because everything that eventually goes wrong here starts with that one quiet piece of paperwork, drafted by a man who never once imagined a Costco. By 1950, Kiddieland was becoming a genuine institution, and that year brought the two rides that would define it for the rest of its existence. The first was a wooden roller coaster called the Little Dipper, built by the Philadelphia Toboggan Company and designed by Herbert Schmeck, one of the most prolific coaster designers in American history, reportedly costing around $20,000, real money in 1950. It wasn't massive. It didn't need to be. It was scaled exactly right for a kid's first roller coaster, low enough that parents weren't nervous, fast enough that a 7-year-old could feel legitimately terrified and legitimately proud of themselves the moment it was over. For a lot of Chicago area kids across 3 generations, this was the first roller coaster of their entire lives. Full stop. The ride everything else later got measured against. Riders who went on to try the giant coasters at bigger parks would still say years later that nothing quite matched the nervous excitement of that first climb up the Little Dipper's hill. The second was a carousel, hand-carved by the same company back in 1925, with horses so detailed that 16 of them were what collectors call signature horses, the master carver's personal showpieces, worked with extra flourishes as a kind of quiet flex of skill. Reports suggest this may be the only Philadelphia toboggan carousel ever built with that many signature horses in one machine. Whether that specific claim holds up under scrutiny or not, the horses themselves were genuine museum-quality woodwork, hand-painted, gold-trimmed, spinning in a suburban parking lot for the price of a single dollar bill, decade after decade, generation after generation. Kiddieland leaned hard into what made it different, marketing itself as the last theme park in the country built exclusively for children. Not a kiddie corner tacked onto something bigger, not a section of a larger property, but an entire park, gate to fence line, designed around people too small to ride the big stuff anywhere else. Old commercials and printed brochures sold exactly that promise. A place scaled for you, not your older brother or sister. For multiple generations of Chicago area families, going to Kiddieland became a rite of passage. School field trips went there every spring, buses lined up in that same parking lot. Summer birthdays happened there by the dozen. Parents who had ridden the Little Dipper as 7-year-olds themselves came back decades later and put their own kids in the same cars, on the same wooden track, under the same sky, feeling the same drop. Fritz died suddenly in 1967, and the business passed to the next generation, who kept it running largely the way he had built it, without much reinvention. Then in 1977, 3 of his grandchildren, along with their spouses, took over as a 4th generation of ownership, and they kept expanding the property, the galleon pirate ship in the mid-1980s, the log jammer flume in 1992, the pipeline water coaster in 1995, the volcano play structure not long after that. By the 2000s, Kiddieland had more than 30 rides scattered across the grounds. From the outside, it looked like a family business that had figured out the impossible. Staying small, staying beloved, staying full of screaming, happy kids for over 70 straight years in an industry that eats small operators alive. But underneath all of that success, there was a problem. And it had nothing to do with attendance or ticket sales or whether kids still loved wooden roller coasters in an age of video games and bigger theme parks. It went all the way back to that estate decision Fritz made decades earlier. The land to one branch of the family, the business to another. By the 2000s, the people running the rides, hiring the staff, and keeping the Little Dipper's 90-year-old track in good repair were legally speaking, tenants. They were renting the ground beneath their own family's legacy from their own relatives. And Melrose Park real estate had changed enormously since 1929. That corner, once just convenient for pony cart traffic, now sat on a roughly 17-acre parcel in a dense, developed suburban corridor, exactly the kind of large, accessible lot that big box retailers spend years actively hunting for and rarely find. The park was thriving. The land underneath it was the problem. In 2004, that tension finally cracked into the open. The landowners, Shirley and Glenn Rhines, sued the people actually running the park, Ronald Rhines Jr. and Kathy and Tom Narini, over a dispute involving insurance coverage and a fireworks lease. On the surface, it sounds like a minor legal squabble, the kind of thing families settle quietly at Thanksgiving and move on from. It wasn't. It was the first visible crack in a relationship that had been straining under the surface for years, the moment the landlord-tenant arrangement stopped being theoretical and started being deeply, uncomfortably personal. Here's the part that should have felt like good news. The park won. Cook County courts sided with the operators. When the landowners appealed, they lost again. If you were watching from the outside, this looked like a clean, decisive victory. The family running the rides had legally defended their right to keep running them. That's a false alarm dressed up as a happy ending, because winning a lawsuit and winning the war turned out to be two very different things, and the family running the rides only realized that later. The landowners didn't need to win in court. They just needed to wait until the lease came up for renewal and let the calendar do what the courtroom couldn't. And in early 2009, that's exactly what happened. The land-owning branch of the family simply declined to renew it. No new lawsuit, no dramatic public falling out, just a lease that quietly wasn't extended, which turned out to be far more effective than any courtroom argument ever could have been. The lawsuit had never been the real threat. Whoever controlled the ground always controlled the outcome, and now that fact was impossible for anyone to ignore. In May 2009, Kiddieland announced it would close permanently at the end of the season. 80 years of continuous operation, coming to an end not because kids stopped showing up, not because the rides broke down, not because some bigger, flashier competitor stole all the customers, but because a family disagreement over a piece of paper signed decades earlier had finally reached its conclusion. And then something happened that made the whole thing feel even more unfair. That final summer, by the owner's own account, drew record crowds. Families who'd grown up riding the Little Dipper showed up one more time, some bringing their own kids for a first ride and a last ride at once. Local news crews came out to film the lines stretching around the parking lot, running segments that leaned hard into nostalgia, interviewing parents who'd been coming since they themselves were children. For a moment, it might have genuinely felt like the sheer weight of public love could change the outcome, that if enough people showed up, cried at the gate, and bought one more ticket, someone somewhere would find a way to save it. Nobody was going to save it. Even as families lined up for one final summer, a major retailer had already filed a letter of intent to build on the site, moving forward with plans before Kiddieland had even closed its gates for the last time. The record crowds weren't a rescue effort. They were a going-away party that nobody involved actually had the power to stop, no matter how many tickets got sold. On September 27, 2009, the gates closed for the last time, 80 years to the era after Arthur Fritz set 6 ponies loose on a dirt lot during the worst economic collapse in American history, a fitting bookend for a business born out of hard times and ended by a different kind of pressure entirely. A little over a week later, on October 3rd, former employees were invited back for one final day, riding the coaster and spinning on the carousel, not as workers but as guests, saying goodbye to a place some of them had spent literal decades of their working lives inside. The park didn't fail. It was simply worth more gone. What followed wasn't the slow, years-long decay you might expect from a story like this. For a few months that fall and winter, the site did sit quiet. Gates chained shut, rides standing still for the first time in 80 years. The Little Dipper's wooden track sitting exposed and empty under a gray Midwest sky that had never once seen it silent for this long. If you'd driven past that November or December, you'd have seen a ghost of a place that had been full of noise just weeks earlier. Empty ticket booths with the windows still intact, a parking lot with nothing parked in it, faded ride signs still bolted up, advertising a season that was never coming back to anyone. But this wasn't a place left to rot for years the way some abandoned parks are, sitting forgotten until nature slowly reclaims the pavement and the paint peels off everything standing. On November 24th, 2009, less than 2 months after closing, an auction house out of Michigan ran a public sale of the entire park, roughly 400 lots, more than 500 registered bidders, some traveling in from as far away as California and New York, all competing to take home a piece of a place that had just stopped existing. Wooden carousel horses went under the gavel one at a time. So did the miniature trains, the ride cars, the signage, the mechanical guts of rides that had run for decades, 80 years of Kiddieland scattered across a single Saturday to the highest bidders in the room, most of them strangers who'd never once set foot in Melrose Park. Reported prices from that day vary depending on the source, but the carousel alone is said to have sold somewhere in the range of $355,000 to $400,000, a staggering number for a ride that had cost a small fraction of that to build back in 1925. The Little Dipper reportedly went for somewhere between $33,000 and $38,000, a figure that feels almost absurdly small next to what that coaster actually meant to the generations of people who grew up riding it. By June 2010, the physical park was gone. Concrete pathways, foundations, the last structural bones of 80 years of history, all torn out and hauled away in a matter of weeks. And on November 17, 2010, a Costco measuring roughly 152,000 square feet opened on the exact footprint where the Little Dipper used to run its loop, bringing somewhere around 175 to 200 jobs to a town that had just watched an institution disappear in under a year. Here's where this story does something most abandoned place documentaries simply can't offer: a genuine afterlife. The rides didn't vanish into a landfill or sit rotting in a field somewhere. They scattered across the country, and in most cases, they kept right on running. The Little Dipper was purchased by Six Flags Great America and rebuilt piece by piece, track and all, reopening there in 2010, so a brand new generation could ride the exact same wooden coaster that once sat behind a Chicago suburb's kiddie gates. The 1925 carousel, after years in storage, was fully restored and now operates at Sonny's Place in Connecticut, its hand-carved horses still spinning 1,500 miles from where they started their careers. The miniature steam trains found a permanent home at the Heston Steam Museum in Indiana, still puffing along their own small track for visitors who have no idea where they came from. A handful of other rides ended up at Santa's Village in East Dundee, Illinois, close enough that some of the original Kiddieland visitors can still drive over and ride them today. The park was gone. The rides somehow weren't. A small, strange kind of comfort for anyone who assumed the whole thing had simply been erased. Back at the original site, one small piece of Kiddieland survived too, and it's arguably the most human detail in the entire story. The old candy-colored entrance sign, the one topped with painted figures of Jack and Jill, was pulled off the property before demolition crews arrived, saved by a Melrose Park Public Works director, who later said plainly that if he hadn't grabbed it, it would have ended up in a scrap heap along with everything else. Instead, it was restored, rewired with modern lighting, and installed outside the Melrose Park Public Library, where it's been glowing every night since 2012. Nearby, a stretch of First Avenue now carries an honorary street sign, Kiddieland Amusement Park Road, and a historical marker was placed that same year, quietly noting 80 years of family fun on a corner that now sells bulk groceries instead of pony rides and roller coaster tickets. Today, shoppers push carts across that exact pavement, loading cases of water and rotisserie chickens into their trunks in the same spot where a wooden coaster once climbed its first hill, where a hand-carved horse once carried a kid around in a circle for the very first time in their life. Most of them have absolutely no idea what used to be there, wheeling their carts past a spot that, for 80 years, was the loudest, happiest corner in the entire town. The building is different, the purpose is different, even the sound is different. No screaming, no calliope music drifting across a parking lot, just the low hum of a loading dock and the beep of a scanner at checkout. The land remembers nothing. The people do. But a few miles away, that old sign still lights up every single night in a library parking lot. Jack and Jill still perched on top exactly where they've always been, watching over a corner of Melrose Park that has nothing left to do with the amusement park it once belonged to, except memory.